Now let's move on to the 7th chapter, Opera, Karate, and Bandits. When she was 80 years old, my grandmother was still quite strong. She could use her own teeth to eat corn on the cob or to chew on sugar plants to extract juice from them. Every 2 days she walked for more than an hour to reach the marketplace, carrying a heavy load of food with her, and then spent another hour walking back home. And even though she was quite old, traces of her beauty still lingered on. Her hands, her feet, her face revealed that she had been an attractive young woman. Nor did time do much damage to the youthful spirit of my grandmother. One of her great passions was theater, and this passion never diminished with age. No matter how busy she was, she never missed a show when there was a group of actors in town. If no actors visited our hamlet for several months, she would organize her own show in which she was the manager, the producer, and the young leading lady, all at the same time. My grandmother's own plays were always melodramas, inspired by books she had read and by what she had seen on the stage. She always chose her favorite grandson to play the role of the hero, who would, without fail, marry the heroine at the end and live happily ever after. And when my sisters would tell her that she was getting too old to play the role of the young heroine anymore, my grandmother merely replied, "Anybody can play this role if she's young at heart." When I was a little boy, my grandmother often took me to see the opera. She knew Chinese mythology by heart, and the opera was often a dramatization of this mythology. On one special occasion during the Lunar New Year celebrations, my favorite holiday, because children could do anything they wanted, and by tradition, no one could scold them, I accompanied my grandmother to the opera. When we reached the theater, I wanted to go in immediately, but my grandmother wanted to linger at the entrance and talk to her friends. She chatted for more than an hour. Finally, we entered the theater, and at that moment, the Faithful One was on stage, singing sadly. The Faithful One is a common character in Chinese opera. He could be a good minister, or a valiant general, or someone who loved and served his king faithfully, but in the end, he is unjustly persecuted by the king, whose opinion of him has been changed by the lies of the flatterer, another standard character. When my grandmother saw the Faithful One on stage, she looked upset and gave a great sigh. I was too interested in what was happening to ask her the reason, and we spent the next 5 hours watching the rest of the opera. Sometimes I cried because my grandmother cried at the pitiful situation of the Faithful One. Sometimes I became angry, as my grandmother did, at the wickedness of the flatterer. When we went home that night, my grandmother was quite sad. She told my mother that she would have bad luck in the following year because when we entered the theater, the Faithful One was on stage. I was puzzled. I told my grandmother that she was confused. It would be a good year for us because we saw the good guy first. But my mother said, "No, son, the Faithful One always is in trouble, and it takes him many years to vindicate himself. Our next year is going to be like one of his bad years." So, according to my mother's and grandmother's logic, we would have been much better off in the new year if we had been lucky enough to see the villain first. My grandmother had married a man whom she loved with all her heart, but who was totally different from her. My grandfather was very shy, never laughed loudly, and always spoke very softly. And physically, he was not as strong as my grandmother, but he excused his lack of physical strength by saying that he was a scholar. About 3 months after their marriage, my grandparents were in a restaurant, and a rascal began to insult my grandfather because he looked weak and had a pretty wife. At first, he just made insulting remarks such as, "Hey, wet chicken, this is no place for a weakling." My grandfather wanted to leave the restaurant, even though he and my grandmother had not yet finished their meal, but my grandmother pulled his shirt sleeve and signaled him to remain seated. She continued to eat and looked as if nothing had happened. Tired of yelling insults without any result, the rascal got up from his table, moved over to my grandparents' table, and grabbed my grandfather's chopsticks. My grandmother immediately wrested the chopsticks from him and struck the rascal on his cheekbone with her elbow. The blow was so quick and powerful that he lost his balance and fell on the floor. Instead of finishing him off, as any street fighter would do, my grandmother let the rascal recover from the blow. But as soon as he got up again, he kicked over the table between him and my grandmother, making food and drink fly all over the place. Before he could do anything else, my grandmother kicked him on the chin. The kick was so swift that my grandfather didn't even see it. He only heard a heavy thud when he saw the rascal tumble backward and collapse on the ground. All the onlookers were surprised and delighted, especially the owner of the restaurant. Apparently, the rascal, one of the best karate fighters of our area, came to his restaurant every day and left without paying for his food or drink, but the owner was too afraid to confront him. While the rascal's friends tried to revive him, everyone else surrounded my grandmother and asked her who had taught her karate. She said, "Who else? My husband." After the fight at the restaurant, people assumed that my grandfather knew karate very well, but refused to use it for fear of killing someone. In reality, my grandmother had received special training in karate from my great-great-uncle from the time she was 8 years old. Anyway, after that incident, my grandfather never had to worry again. Anytime he had some business downtown, people treated him very well, and whenever anyone happened to bump into him on the street, they bowed to my grandfather in a very respectful way. When my father was about 10 years old, a group of bandits attacked our house. There had been a very poor harvest that year, and bandits had already attacked several homes in other hamlets. My grandmother had a premonition this would also happen to them, so she devised a plan. In case of danger, she would carry the children to safety, and my grandfather would carry the bow and arrows, a bottle of poison, and the box containing the family jewels. It was night when the bandits came. My grandfather became scared to death and forgot his part of the plan, but my grandmother remained very calm. She led her husband and children to safety through a secret back door that opened into a double hedge of cactus that allowed a person to walk inside undetected to the banana grove. When they were safely inside the banana grove, my grandfather realized that he had forgotten the bow and arrows and the bottle of poison. So my grandmother stole back into the house and retrieved the weapons. The bandits were still trying to smash through our very solid front door when she sneaked out of the house for the second time. She dipped one arrow in poison and crawled around to the front of the house near the bandits, but upon second thought, she put the poisoned arrow aside and took another arrow and carefully aimed at the leg of the bandit leader. When the arrow hit his thigh, the bandit let out a loud cry and fell backward. The night was so dark that none of the bandits knew where the arrow had come from. And moments later, friends started arriving and began to attack them from the road in front of our house. The bandits panicked and left in a hurry, but my grandmother spent the rest of the night with her family in the banana grove, just in case the bandits came back. When my grandmother became older, she felt sick once in a while. Before the arrival of the doctor, she would order everybody in the house to look sad. And during the consultation with the doctor, she acted as if she were much sicker than she really was. My grandmother felt that she had to make herself look really sick so that the doctor would give her good medicine. She told the doctor that she had a pain in the head, in the shoulders, in the chest, in the back, in the limbs, pain everywhere. Finally, the doctor would become confused and wouldn't know what could be wrong with her. Whenever the doctor left, my mother would sneak out of the house, meet him at the other side of the garden, and tell him exactly where my grandmother hurt. 2 or 3 days later, my grandmother usually felt much better, but before the doctor arrived for another visit, she ordered us to look sad again. Not as sad as the first time, but quite sad. She would tell the doctor that her situation had improved a little bit, but that she still felt quite sick. My grandmother thought that if she told the doctor she had been feeling much better, he would stop giving her good medicine. When the doctor left, my mother sneaked out of the house again and informed him of the real condition of my grandmother. I don't think my grandmother ever guessed it was my mother's reports to the doctor and not her acting that helped her get well. One morning, my grandmother wanted me to go outside with her. We climbed a little hill that looked over the whole area, and when we got to the top, she looked at the rice field below, the mountain on the horizon, and especially at the river. As a young girl, She had often brought her herd of water buffaloes to the river to drink while she swam with the other children of the village. Then we visited the graveyard, where her husband and some of her children were buried. She touched her husband's tombstone and said, "Dear, I will join you soon." And then we walked back to the garden, and she gazed at the fruit trees her husband had planted, a new one for each time she had given birth to a child. Finally, before we left the garden, my sister joined us, and the two of them fed a few ducks swimming in the pond. Here's a picture of that, the grandma and the sister feeding the ducks in the pond. Love it. That evening, my grandmother did not eat much of her dinner. After dinner, she combed her hair and put on her best dress. We thought that she was going to go out again, but instead she went to her bedroom and told us that she didn't want to be disturbed. The family dog seemed to sense something was amiss, for he kept looking anxiously at everybody and whined from time to time. At midnight, my mother went to my grandmother's room and found that she had died, with her eyes shut as if she were sleeping normally. It took me a long time to get used to the reality that my grandmother had passed away. Wherever I was in the house, in the garden, out on the fields, her face always appeared so clearly to me. And even now, many years later, I still have the feeling that my last conversation with her has happened only a few days before.